Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Bullets and Bourbon. I'm Matt Gundlach, and we have returning guest Adam Majors. It's been a while since we've talked, Adam. I know I've been busy, you've been busy. I've kind of taken a back seat with the podcast, just trying to enjoy life and compete and all that. But how have you been, man?
Doing pretty good, Matt. Thanks for having me back. Been staying busy and taking care of myself and my family and working, keeping up with work at the Battle Within and everything that we have going on there with our programs. So all in all, things have been great.
No, that's pretty good. And yeah, I mean, after our last conversation that we had on the phone, and I know we've had short conversations about the battle within. Like, I was like, you know what, I need to talk about that. I need to bring that up. But first we'll get on to some of the Odysseus and the Oar, which chapter 4 was just absolutely phenomenal. It's one of the first areas where you know, like you really see some kind of action with Odysseus and Polyphemus and everything, and it just the parallels and the correlations between him and modern warriors and what goes on. But before we start all that, we've talked about the shadow, and you start talking about digging deep into uncomfortable areas and devoting time in a sober manner, which is for most people really unknown territory. Like really just kind of digest everything that you're feeling and looking how to bring that out. Like that's not common with most people, and most people I don't think are really comfortable doing that, just taking that introspective. But what are some techniques that you can take to help process these feelings?
Yeah. So a few things. For people who've listened to our previous conversations, they've, I think, probably heard us talk about the shadow
Hmm.
to some extent, right? But just as a recap, or an introduction for anybody who's maybe just jumping in with this episode, um, Jung viewed the shadow as basically all of the non-ego aspects of the self. So anything that's unconscious.
Hmm.
And when I say non-ego, the ego would be the center of the subjective personality. It's like what we think of as I or me. And while we like to think that that's the whole psyche, like our whole personality, it's not. It's just kind of one aspect of it. And there are all these other things and all these other forces going on inside of us that we would consider shadow if we are not conscious of them. And that the shadow can manifest in a variety of ways. And we see that mostly in dreams, but we also see it reflected in myths like the Odyssey. So in my book, one of the things that readers of the Odyssey will see is that Odysseus often comes into contact with other characters who exert influence over him, who change the direction he's going.
Like Calypso, or yeah, Calypso was one. I can't think of the other one, though. The
Yeah,
witch,
yeah, Circe. Yep.
Circe. Yeah.
Circe. Yeah, and Polyphemus is one of those too, right? The
Hmm.
Cyclops that he meets in the cave. And but these figures are figures that Odysseus has to contend with, and we see this in our own dreams at night. You'll go to bed and you sleep and you have a dream about some other figure that you come up against that's that's having some effect on you, that's creating a challenge you have to overcome, that you're running from or whatever. And so these other figures in the psyche are aspects of the self that we're obliged to be in relationship with in one way or another.
Hmm.
And that ignoring them, turning away from them just creates problems for us. And usually, if we turn toward it, it's a gift. We can learn things about ourselves, we can grow and transform. And usually, on the whole, it's something that can make us healthier and better off. So, sometimes people talk about shadow work, and I kind of think that that is it strikes me as cheesy, but also kind of is a bit ignorant in a way. just because when something's unconscious, by definition, it's very hard to work with.
Hmm.
Like if it's unconscious, then you don't know it's there.
Right.
So, you know, ultimately, one of the things that I like to do is to create space for having some insight around something that might just barely be conscious, right? And so, let me kind of think of an example. So, with a lot of veterans that I've worked with, right, through the battle within, um, we will be in the midst of a discussion, right? So I'll give you an example from one veteran I worked with recently at the program, and he was being very, very hard on himself, um, and was using like derogatory language to refer to himself in a particular way. You know, that he had a very, very poor view of himself, and while of course I think consciously he was aware of what he was saying, I don't think he related to the fact that there is another aspect of the psyche that is abusing him, right? And so we would refer to this kind of broadly speaking within psychodynamic language, within the language of like the psychodynamic theory. We would call that a negative introject.
Would that
This
be
is,
like a negative self-image?
yes, that, yeah, like an inner critic that we have
Hmm.
internalized. So other people talking to us like that causes us to internalize it, and then we start to beat ourselves up too.
Yep. And we have that like in the competition world, like we will beat ourselves up.
Hmm.
And one of the things like whenever I compete, uh, it's always trying to maintain a positive self-image because if you have that negative self-image about yourself, your performance is going to suffer and you don't even
Yes,
realize it. And so I generally tell people, hey, you have 5 minutes to go stand over there in a corner away from everybody else and work out what's going on in your head. And you come right back over here because what just happened is over with, and you got to focus on the next task.
bingo. Yeah, and that's a great example of how these things can show up, right?
Hmm.
And and then on the side, right? So a person could do deeper work around that once they get home from the competition,
Hmm.
right? So you come home and you pull out your journal, and then you can kind of get to work. And so to answer your question about how do we get in touch with the feelings and how do we get in touch with these aspects of shadow, and kind of I'll use that example of this guy who's beating himself up. And what I told him in particular, I was like, I encourage you to get out your journal and pretend like you're writing a screenplay,
Hmm.
that here's me and here's what I'm saying, and here's this other figure I'm in contact with. And so I said, I want you to imagine the bully, the inner
Hmm.
critic, the negative introject. I want you to imagine that and tell me what that figure looks like. What does it look like? And he said it was just this, you know, this
Gorilla.
blood-covered warrior, is how he put it.
Hmm.
Blood-covered warrior. And I said, okay, so come up with a name for him. Give him a name. And I want you to dialogue with him. And and then we'll come back and we'll examine it further, right? And so he did. And so here's him, and he wrote it all out, and that this is him, and this is what he said to this figure, and this is what the figure said back to him. And he's having a conversation with it, dialoguing with this other part of himself. And you want to be curious and say, why are you like this? What do you think you're getting out of beating me up like this? Like what's your goal? And it might say something like, I'm trying to make you better. And then you can say, what, I'm not good enough? And it can say, no, you're not good enough. Well, what's wrong with me? And then, then we can add other layers to the conversation and look at other aspects of the shadow. And so you might think about the other parts of you that are hurting in this. And so maybe there's a little kid in there that is suffering this abuse, right? And so you can imagine the conversation growing where now there's this abusive figure, And there's also this innocent kid in there that's taking all this abuse. And then maybe it grows even further. Maybe there's another part of the self that's like an Obi-Wan Kenobi or a Yoda or a Gandalf that can confront this dark figure and add some wisdom or add some soothing and healing to the innocent parts of the self.
Hmm.
And basically, what we're doing is we're dialoguing with different parts of the self that are kind of like experienced as other, right? And I think that can unlock a lot of emotion that a lot of times that these wounded parts of the self um, can look really ugly. And as we relate to them, we tend to discover that there's a lot of pain wrapped up and where they're coming from. So I'm a big fan of writing, therapeutic writing, and dialoguing with these different aspects of the self that come out in these kind of nefarious ways. So that's a big tool for me. And as one for Jung. So Jung called this active imagination, and this process is really what's behind his Red Book, which was his journal through a lot of the most challenging years of his life. And they also led to some of his most important discoveries about psychology.
Wow.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, um, I guess we'll kind of get talking into about Polyphemus now. So, can you talk about the name of Polyphemus and the correlation it has with the psyche, and then further expand upon the correlation it has with Odysseus himself and how he acted on the island of Ismarus in the land of the Lotus Eaters?
Yeah. So I'm really glad that you're asking me this question because I actually think this is something I missed a little bit in the book. I do speak to some of this, but maybe not in the same way that I would if I were writing it today. But Polyphemus, and one of the things I do talk about in the book is that, obviously the poly aspect of the name
Hmm.
suggests there's many,
Yep.
right? And that the famous part refers to fame, or much spoken of. So the name kind of roughly translated might be much spoken of. And a lot of the characters' names in the Odyssey have a bit of an ironic meaning or even just any kind of, there's a meaningful connotation that goes with them. And I think Polyphemus's name is one of those names that's really deeply meaningful because here's this figure that's supposedly much spoken of or very famous,
Hmm.
and Odysseus doesn't seem to know who he is. And he's the son of Poseidon, right? And so when Odysseus and his men land on this island, um, the poem says that they basically go into his cave and they start to steal his shit, you
Yep.
know? But then Odysseus, as he's relating the story, he accuses Polyphemus of being primitive, and
Which is
um,
interesting because he's the son of a god, and he may talk rather simple, but he's actually, let's take it back a step. He's living off the land. Everything is kind of provided. Like he has goats, he has um berries. He has everything to survive off. He's living a very simple but hospitable life, much like Enkidu whenever he was, originally molded, um, to be a challenger to Gilgamesh, living a
yes,
very simple life out in the woods. Was there was he wasn't a very complex figure at first, until him and Gilgamesh became very good friends.
yeah, yeah, and that's a very important insight too, in that you're making the connection between Enkidu from the Epic of Gilgamesh and Polyphemus and the Odyssey, and that both are these kind of wild, hairy men who have a transformative effect to some degree on the so-called heroes of these stories. And that wild man figure or the shadow figure is a common archetypal figure in many myths around the world. You even see it in the Bible with Jacob and Esau, where
Hmm.
Esau is the wild man covered in hair,
Hmm.
right? but this twin brother figure. So that's a bit of a motif. And Polyphemus is in this role. He's this wild man, primitive, close to nature, close to the earth. And although Odysseus has a lot of negative things to say about Polyphemus, he's like devaluing him.
Hmm.
As you pointed out, he's he's quite innocent. He's close to nature. He's there's what's so bad about the way
People
he's
thought he
living?
was barbaric,
Right. And
but
that if anybody's barbaric here, right? And this is the point I make in my book that uh one could say that Polyphemus was the healthy, developed one,
hmm
whereas Odysseus and his men were the primitive, barbaric guys. I mean, these are the guys who've just raided the people of Isthmus, put the people to the sword, raped the women, stole all their shit, and then went to the land of the Lotus Eaters where, they're getting high and forgetting all about their home. So who here is really the primitive or barbaric one, right?
yep,
And
absolutely.
and now here they are in the cave of Polyphemus stealing his shit. And and ultimately, so coming back to his name, the he's the one who's much spoken of. He's very famous, as we'd say, and he's the son of Poseidon, right? And I think this is a key bit of the story that I wish I would have driven this home better in the book. But um, it speaks to Odysseus's ignorance of the laws of nature and the uh, the spiritual realities of the world that he's in. And so, one of the things that I think one of the key messages of the Odyssey is that for a warrior to truly transcend the realm of war and to successfully come home from war, he needs to be spiritually developed. And I don't mean religiously developed, I mean spiritually developed, like connected to something beyond himself in a real way, and that Odysseus's ignorance of who Polyphemus even is, he doesn't know. He doesn't realize that this much spoken of or very famous figure who anyone should know if they were acquainted with the spiritual realm, like you would know this is the son of Poseidon. And Poseidon is the one god you can't offend if you're hoping to sail home from war, like to piss off the god of the sea would be to ruin your chances of a successful homecoming. And Odysseus is so ignorant, he misses that.
Well, I draw upon it like the ego, the amount of ego that Odysseus had. He was a very cunning individual who could um talk his way out of a situation. He can do a lot, and like you describe it in the book and in the story, Odysseus, whenever he talks to Polyphemus and gives his name, he says his name is no one. Well,
Yes.
his ego got in the way as they were leaving, and he gave he gave his name away, and then that's how Polyphemus knew who he was and cursed him and asked Poseidon to help. And now there's this veil put around the island of Ithaca, and yeah, it took forever to get home.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that part of the story you just touched on is really important too, where when he goes into the cave and Polyphemus asks who he is, he says, "My name is No Man,"
Yes,
which is meaningful, and that it's a play on words here, and when it's written in ancient Greek, because it's metis,
yes.
and that metis uh, also speaks to a quality that Odysseus has, like it's his cunning nature is also metis, and that ultimately, and declaring that he is metis or no man, he's not only disowned who he truly is, but he's also playing into this trickster quality he has, right? That's kind of defining him. And as long as he is unwilling and unable to really fully know himself and to own his identity in a way that's real, he'll never really be able to get home. And later on in the story, when he's finally with the Phaeacians, there's a really critical moment where he breaks down crying as he's being confronted with the pain that he caused when he was at war in Troy. And um,
I
and
found that aspect, like whenever he's with the Phaeacians
yep,
and they have him in court and he introduced himself, like for a while there he was like
he was no
he
man again.
I was
No
no
one knew who
man.
he was. Yeah,
And then he heard the story of the Trojan War and he was like, I need you to stop.
yeah,
And so the queen was like, well, you are definitely somebody. And so then he finally came out and introduced himself and he was like,
yes,
I have a story to tell you. And
yep,
then he had to relive every moment and dig deep and talk about every travesty he went through
yep.
and what his men caused and what he caused on the journey trying to get home.
Yes, and
And,
and that he finally owns his true identity. And I think that this is something about when Odysseus is meeting Polyphemus and he's asked who he is, he doesn't have the ability to do that yet.
mm-hmm,
He doesn't have an ability to dialogue with the shadow. That when he's asked who he is, he runs from it.
mm-hmm,
He has an opportunity to declare who he is and maybe make a connection with the shadow, with the unconscious, to build a bridge to something deeper. And instead, he botches the whole situation, and he has to pay a price for it. And I think relating that to our lives, as veterans and all of that, I actually just today I spoke with a veteran who just retired after 29 years of service. He got out in June. He's currently homeless. He was kicked out of his home by his wife. He's going through a really hard time. And I think he's gotten in his own way.
mm-hmm.
I think that he's created a lot of his present suffering because he's not yet been in a place to be really honest with himself or to
Ego.
to learn how to die. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and to dialogue with himself. As I was talking with him today, I mean, he's in this very low place, living in his car, trying to get a place to live. But he was telling me about, kind of his resume and his awards and, his Legion of Merit and all this stuff. And, the rank and all the things he accomplished and attained. And I mean, he has so much to be proud of. But in this moment, I mean, none of it matters. He's living in his car. It's like everything he accomplished is, he's kind of asking this question of like, what's it worth after 29 years? And I've been out for a month and I'm homeless already, you know?
Yeah.
And it's hard to hear those stories. And my heart really went out uh, to him. And at the end of the day, it's going to be a long road, because all of us, and this guy included, we have to learn to be humble and to be honest with ourselves about who we really are. And that's a very tough thing to do, and it takes a while usually. It takes some suffering before we achieve that kind of humility and can ask those tough questions.
And I kind of look at that situation. I could be completely off base and not, and I'm not trying to be harsh, but it sounds like that's somebody who worked it till the end and didn't give themselves time prior to getting out to
Bingo.
really take the time to figure out who am I now and who do I want to be whenever I retire?
Yeah.
Like one of the things, one of the first things I did, like I still go round to my old job at the Marine Corps shooting team to see everybody. Not to reminisce, but just to hang out. But like when I first started doing that, people were still calling me Gunny, and it's just like, hey guys, call me Matt. Like,
Yeah.
I am a person outside of the Marine Corps. Like I don't live like that was a past life. All my accomplishments and everything that I did and everything I did with you guys, like that's in the past. Like let's build a relationship moving forward to where it's like I'm Matt, you're Tyler, like we're friends. I'm not your boss. Like thank you for respecting me, but like hey, like we can respect each other as friends. And that's how I live my life. Like the Marine Corps was a past life, which I'm very proud of, but I don't live my life by it now.
Yeah. Yeah, this is one of those things that, when you're 30 days out, it's
If you haven't figured it out, it's too late.
yeah, that and it's sad. I think that, some of the responsibility is ours to carry as individuals,
Hmm.
but I also tend to believe that the United States military kind of owes that to us as well, that they turned us into soldiers, Marines, whatever. And I think there's some responsibility
You're absolutely
to
right.
discharge us as civilians and not as, war fighters.
In one of the things I commonly tell people now, and like this is why I'm involved in the nonprofit Four Block. We've all been through separations and went through that process, and we know it's junk because it's being taught by a civilian who has never gotten out of the military and doesn't necessarily know the problems that arise whenever a person gets out. They don't know how to write a resume. They don't know what to put in. They don't know how to construct a resume or read a job description and really understand what's being put in there. So you're absolutely right in the statement of like the military does not do a good job of preparing people to get out and leaders within the military like they're not prepared to help people get out because they themselves have never gotten out, and that is, I mean, that's why I'm involved in that nonprofit, because it's separations on steroids where, hey, we're helping you build your network, we're helping you write your resume, we're helping you with the elevator pitch and the interview, and like we're taking you through the paces and just teaching you everything that you need to do in order to prepare to build a future and build a future, get a future career once you get out.
Yeah. Yeah, and frankly, most people do not appreciate how badly it's needed.
Hmm.
I this past week, I talked to two veterans who were living in their cars who I was trying to help get some emergency housing.
Hmm.
And I mean, this is stuff that a lot of people do not appreciate how unbelievably talented, skilled soldiers and Marines and airmen end up in dire situations. I know a Green Beret
Hmm.
who was homeless after, like, God, I think he had like 7 deployments and like 20 years in, and was literally going through a trash can behind a restaurant looking for a meal to eat. I mean, and I mean, yes, we as individuals have some responsibility, absolutely. And at the same time, a lot of people do not appreciate how much war and, military training, military culture literally warps the psyche and changes us for the task of war fighting in ways that are very counterproductive to having a healthy life in the civilian world. And I think that is reflected in this episode with Polyphemus, that here's a guy who is adapted for warfighting. He is trained for combat. His task is to close with and destroy the enemies of the people of Greece.
Hmm.
And that's what he did for 10 years in Troy. He cut people down with his sword, he took them out with his arrows. And when he's in this cave, he's not he's not about to dialogue with this other figure. He's figuring out how to take him down, and that's what he does. He stabs him in the eye, steals his shit, and heads out the door.
Hmm.
And, and there's just all of us, I think all of us, we often struggle after the service because, you know,
That's
that's
what we're taught.
yeah, that's what we are taught, that if there is a wall, run through it.
Hmm.
If there's an obstacle, go to war with it. And all the time I see this in even the veterans mental health realm, all of these analogies being made to fighting PTSD, or stab your suffering in the face. And it's like, man, you guys, that's the fucking problem right there. Because You have to learn to relate to your pain with curiosity and compassion. You have to learn to go to your anxiety, your fear, your hypervigilance, your sadness, and hold it with nurturance so that it can be transformed into something else. But as long as you're going to war with it and you're in conflict with it, the tension's just going to be greater and the suffering's going to be worse. So, yeah, we need a complete and total transformation of how we look at this stuff. And I think, the ancient Greeks, to their credit, they recognize this. And I think that's why we have the Odyssey.
So, do you think it's important for a person to face conflict or to go through conflict? And is it natural for veterans who retire? We have those guys who do 4 years and get out. We have guys who do 20 and 30 years and get out. Is it natural to see conflict arise later on, even after retirement, and military service is over?
Do you mean like internal conflict or conflict with other people?
I would say more internal conflict.
Yeah, so that internal conflict is an inevitable and necessary aspect of the transformation process. And ultimately, I mean, think about it this way, right? That when a person has adapted to a particular task, like going to war, right? That when they're adapted to the tasks that they have, and whether it's going to war or keeping up with a spreadsheet, if they're just adapted for that, or if they're just adapted for navigating military culture and relating in a particular way and doing things a certain way, um, none of that training or those experiences prepare you to know what to do when your marriage falls apart, or when you somebody has an affair, or when you lose your job and you get fired, or someone you love gets diagnosed with something terrible. And so when you end up in the realm of suffering, or when old traumatic memories come back from combat on a deployment that happened 20 years ago or whatever it is, right? But when this suffering finds you, and it always does, none of us are really ever adapted to that, right? Like we are not um experts most of the time. Very few of us are experts in overcoming suffering in a way that's healthy and emotionally mature and that leads to transformation and greater depth, right? We usually repress it, stuff it down, we compartmentalize. That's not dealing with it. That's just going around it.
Hmm.
Um, and so ultimately we have to transform, like this person we were has to transform into someone else that knows how to hold suffering, that knows what to do with a panic attack, that knows what to do with profound and terrible grief, and to work with it in a way that's deepening and healing. And so in these moments, internal conflict is almost always going to happen because we're going to be coming up against the parts of ourselves that stand in the way. And we're going to be coming up against the parts of ourselves that are trying to intervene to help us. And so the best thing that we can do is, and I think I'm not a Buddhist, but I'm very fond of Buddhism purely because I think the Buddhist mindset is so productive as it relates to healing and transformation. That for Buddhists, the kind of basic mindset is one of curiosity and openness and a willingness to be vulnerable with oneself and others. And so when suffering comes along, they say, "Oh, I'm noticing some sadness there, or I'm noticing some fear here. What does this have to teach me? Come on in. I'm going to make you a cup of tea, and I want you to tell me about your fear. I want you to tell me about your sadness." And when we do that, there's a whole lot less of a conflict, right? Versus if I start to feel anxious and I'm like, "Oh, don't want to feel that. I'm gonna go crack open a beer," you
Hmm.
know, or I'm gonna go turn on the TV so I don't have to feel that or do anything, right? And I think that that's really where the conflict gets intense because um, avoidance of anxiety or avoidance of emotion and anxiety go hand in hand. And the more we're trying to like run from or avoid what we're feeling, the more internal conflict we're going to have. And the more internal conflict we have, the worse we're going to feel.
So let me get your thoughts, since we're talking about Buddhism, which seems like it's more being in tune with your feelings and analyzing them. Um, Stoicism, most people say Stoics don't have or don't feel any emotion, which isn't necessarily true. It's just Stoics tend to not let uh, things from the outside really affect themselves internally. Um, so what's your thoughts on that and taking that approach?
Yeah, so I don't think that they're like diabolically opposed, Buddhism and Stoicism. I think that they could exist hand in hand. And on one hand, Stoicism, it has its strengths, but I would also say it's kind of, I don't think it's well rounded.
Hmm.
And for me, I'm a big believer in having lots and lots of tools. I don't know many guys who, when they go out and they go to set up a garage, if they won $1 million and they can build a perfect garage, I don't many guys who'd be like, oh, I'm just gonna get a shit ton of hammers.
Hmm.
They want wrenches. They want different kinds of wrenches. They want to have everything in their arsenal that they possibly could to fix anything that comes up. And so I kind of think of stoicism as like one range of tools.
Hmm.
It'd be like having a bunch of hammers or something. That's definitely not going to fix every problem that comes your way. And I think that stoicism is useful as a mindset, but not in terms of skills. You
Right.
know, because so many skills or so many different kinds of suffering require real skill, and they also require not just minimizing or relativizing. So a lot of stoicism is like cognitive skills, like top-down skills, like brain down to your body. The
Hmm.
way that you're relating to it is very intellectual and cognitive. But so much of like actual healing from trauma has to come from the body. And that what the body and the soul, that suffering is a product of the soul. The soul is trying to bring us suffering so we can turn toward it and heal from it. Like our soul isn't stupid, our psyche isn't stupid. It's created this suffering. It's like a necessary part of a natural process. This is nature doing its work. And, as the ancient alchemists would say, that the cure is in the poison. You got to feel it to heal from it, right?
Hmm.
The in the anxiety is also the cure from the anxiety. And so, what I like about Buddhism being mirrored with it, like Buddhism, I think is like also has a lot of elements that um, are also mindset focused, but it's also very much focused on relating to the pain in a way that's deeply empathetic, compassionate, and curious. And I think that that's really essential, right? That I don't necessarily in Stoicism, I don't feel the compassion and empathy for oneself that it's really necessary when somebody's got to do deep work to heal.
Hmm.
And we got to be honest too, so one of the biggest criticisms I would have of Stoicism is like as a holistic philosophy because I don't actually think it's holistic. Um, and by the way, I endorse Stoicism. Let me say that. I think Stoicism is fine. I just don't. I think it would be a mistake for anybody to think it's like
The only
a
way.
comprehensive, yeah, a comprehensive package that answers all of the problems that life can throw at you.
Hmm.
And so I'd say it's both and much more. Um, but ultimately, at the end of the day, um, one of my biggest criticisms of Stoicism would be that a lot of the guys who eat bullets and who die of suicide are profoundly stoic,
Yep.
not in an academic sense, but in a lived reality sense.
Yes. Yeah. No, I would agree. I think the majority of the military is built around stoicism. It's that mindset, that culture, that aspect that you're raised in. to not react to a negative situation and allow it to affect your psyche, and that way you can just keep pushing on.
Yeah. And, Jung, I think that one of the things that made Jung famous, right? Um, the experiment which made him famous was called the word association experiment. And that is the experiment in which he proved complexes. And that's what got him the attention of Sigmund Freud, who was kind of like the father of psychology at the time. And in the word association experiment, he would read a list of words, and the person was hooked up to a machine that was detecting all of their physiological responses. And he would note how long and how they would respond to certain stimuli, certain words. And so if he said mother, the other person would respond with a word, and they might say father, they might say daughter, they might say love, and they might respond quickly and matter of factly without any reaction. But someone else might stutter or might laugh and not be able to think of anything. And Jung noted that when that happens, what he was noting was that there was an interruption of consciousness. That in these moments when people had a difficult time responding to words or would have abnormal reactions to it and physiological reactions to it, that was detected by this machine, which that machine was the first ever lie detector to test. And it wasn't picking up lies, it was detecting complexes.
Hmm.
So Jung built that. He created it. And ultimately, what he was showing was that it's almost like there's foreign bodies of consciousness that exist within the psyche, which he calls complexes, which can overthrow the flow of consciousness and disrupt the ego's ability to direct the flow of consciousness. And I think that that is something that challenges a lot of our ideas of like, or even it challenges a lot of the things that we think about Stoicism and cognitive behavioral theory and cognitive behavioral therapy, because all of those exist with this fantasy that we're actually in charge of our experience, and that is a fantasy. That is not the reality. That apart from the word association experiment, there's a bunch of research that has called into question and actually proven that we do not really get to choose what we experience. And I think a panic attack is a great example of that, right? Like, as much as you don't want to experience this, there's something else in you which is dictating and saying, yes, you do. You're going to experience it, whether you like it or not. You
Hmm.
can choose how do you respond, but you're along for the ride when these complexes get activated, when something gets activated in you. So all that to say, um, at the end of the day, we're obliged to be in relationship with the unconscious, and that the polyphemus of the psyche, the different parts of us that want their due, are suffering. All of that's going to find us one way or another, and I think the best way to relate to it is just to be open-minded, curious, and open to the possibility that these things might have something valuable to teach us.
So is it a much more is it a much deeper and more involved process with helping someone who is older and did more military service versus somebody who only did 4 years? Like, have you noticed a correlation, or is it kind of hit or miss based on the individual?
Totally depends. Yeah, I've recently worked with a 21-year-old at the beginning of his career, who has loads and loads and loads of childhood trauma. There's a ton of work, a lot of work ahead of him, you know. I've also worked with 21-year-olds who are like so profoundly mature and have such, they've not had as many challenges in life. They've had wonderful parents and lots of support. They have like, profound character and wisdom, and this stuff is kind of almost second nature to them. It's like they have a ability to relate to this stuff on a deep level. And, on the other end of the spectrum, I've talked to guys who are shit, I've talked to 80-year-olds, 80-year-old Vietnam vets who are a train wreck, you
Hmm.
know. that their family members would tell you that they were horrible, abusive people that have left a wake of tragedy behind them. And these people are like deeply, they're deeply unwell and have hurt a lot of people along the way. And I've also talked to, people who are older and more experienced or at the end of a career who have really learned because they've been humble, right? Like you think about every leader you've known that you really look up to or people that you really treasure because they're great,
Hmm.
usually deeply curious, humble people who are open to learning from their mistakes. And, again, I think that makes them amenable to learning and looking within themselves to say, you know, I noticed that part of me that came up in that meeting, that's not the best of me. They're almost kind of doing this intuitively when they're that reflective. And I'm like, gosh, there's that old crotchety pain in the ass part of me again. I really need to pay attention to that.
Hmm.
So,
Oh, awesome. And I appreciate you expounding upon this last segment that we just covered. I want to switch gears, and we've talked about the battle within, not really at length, but can you remind the listeners what this organization is and how it helps veterans?
yeah. So I'm the clinical manager there, and the Battle Within's a nonprofit based in Kansas City, Missouri. And we do several things, but there's kind of two main programs that we have, and they're for veterans and first responders. And so the first is the 5-day Revenant Journey program, and it's like a 5-day intensive, and it's almost like a boot camp for the soul. And in the ancient world, throughout the ancient world, from Navajo culture to ancient Greece, there's a lot of evidence that people and cultures were intentional about helping veterans transition from the task of warfighting to the task of healing and finding a new identity as a civilian again. And our program with the Revenant Journey, it's kind of what we're doing is it's 5 days and it's a clinical program where we're doing group therapy, but it doesn't look or feel like traditional therapy at all. You know, that every day we are actually following the Odyssey. The Odyssey is kind of the blueprint, and we're going through this hero's journey, and we're doing experiential therapy. So some of it takes place out on the ropes course. We do something called the ceremony for the dead. We do equine therapy with horses. And all of the therapeutic experiences are kind of designed to help improve our emotional flexibility because ultimately research shows that the more emotionally flexible we are, the more space we have for emotions, the less we're going to suffer across the board. And so a lot of the work we do in the group therapy process is giving people an opportunity to talk about how they're really feeling and how they're really doing. And a lot of guys will become very emotional as they're sharing, guys and gals. And a lot of guys will say things like, shit, I've been carrying this for 20 years and like this is the first time I've ever let this out. And it just feels so good to know that there's other people here who feel the same way I do. Or like, I haven't been able to share this because I always have to be Captain so and so or Sergeant so and so. And it's really nice to be able to take that mask off and just be honest and just allow myself to be human for once. Like I've been carrying this in secret. I had a veteran SWAT officer that after 30 years was saying, like, I wish I would have done this at the beginning of my career because maybe I'd still have a family.
Hmm.
And so it's deeply meaningful. But apart from that part of it, every afternoon we're doing psychoeducation, learning about emotional regulation skills and what specifically we can do with our anxiety, with our depression or our grief, with moral injury. And we're kind of building out a map for ourselves of what do I do with this, you know, to work with it in a productive way that leads me to healing. And we're learning more about our personalities and understanding more about what makes us tick the way we do. There's also opportunities where we're doing psychoeducation, learning about family of origin trauma, family conflict, family dynamics. and understanding and kind of picking apart our experiences to get a sense of the major challenges we face and what we can do about them. So it's very practical, and at the same time, it's depth oriented. It's very much focused not just on practical things like improving emotional flexibility and emotional regulation skills, but it's also taking us deeper into recognizing parts of ourselves that get in the way, parts of ourselves that need attention, and how we build a relationship with those parts of ourselves so that we can grow and change and transform. So, 5 days boot camp for the soul. It's completely free. All somebody's got to do is apply for the program, get on the call with a member of our clinical team. You get cleared, you get rostered for a cohort. You got to get yourself to Kansas City, but once you're here, we take care of all your lodging. Everything's on us, no expenses at all. We also have something called the Frontline Therapy Network. And if I'm not mistaken, I think we're in like 37 states. So as long as we have a licensed therapist in your state, we can refer you to a therapist and cover at least 6 sessions, and hook you up with somebody who takes your insurance so that you can use your insurance to fund sessions beyond that. We'll do a clinical interview with you and try to get a sense of what kind of therapy or therapist is likely to help you with whatever you have going on. And then once we get you hooked up with that person, you know, uh, they'll kind of take you from there and get you on the right track. So whatever people are struggling with, whether it's processing trauma from a past deployment or working through marital issues or challenges at work, or maybe you're on the job that's not right for you and you got to find something new but don't really know who you are or where to go. All those things are good topics for therapy. And at the end of the day, people use our programs for a lot of reasons, and it's got a pretty broad impact. So, part of my job at the Battle Within as a clinical manager is I get to analyze our data, look at the outcomes. Every year when we do our program evaluations, and the outcomes are pretty outstanding. They're clinically significant, so people do feel a lot better after they go through the program. Some of the benefits are immediate, some of them are long term. Actually, I'd say all of them are long term. So we have data going back for about 5 years now, and what we see is that people tend to get better and better and better with time. So it's kind of
Nice.
a gift that keeps on giving.
So the journey that you guys and the Revenant journey that you put people through, is it pretty much set in stone the process that you put in place, or is it constantly evolving?
It pretty much stays the same. The only time where it ever changes is if an activity gets rained out. So there's one activity that has the potential to get rained out. Um, And if we get a bad storm that rolls through, we usually do an alternate activity that we have planned instead. It has the same goals and we achieve the same things. We just do it differently. But yeah, it's set in stone. It follows the same process and storyline. And so yeah, and there's some organic components of it. Every cohort's different in a way. So even though all the activities are the same, the storyline is the same, the members of the cohort bring their stuff to it. And so it's always unique. You
Hmm.
know. So different things get expressed just based on who showed up and what they've brought into the program.
All right. And are there any other organizations nationwide that do something similar or is structured relatively the same?
Yeah. So there are other organizations out there that do this stuff, and I could name them if you want me to. Um, the other organizations that I'm aware of that do it, some of them I would recommend, others I would not, just because I'm deeply familiar with them and the folks behind them, and I'm not sure that all of them are.
In it for the right reasons?
Yeah, and I don't know that they're safe, you
Mm.
know? And so like for example, at the Battle Within, we have a no war story rule. We don't allow our participants to come in and talk about the worst things that have ever happened to them, because to be a trauma-informed program means that you're actively avoiding re-traumatization.
Hmm.
And that we know from doing our surveys that the average participant coming into our program has very, very, very poor emotional regulation skills. And so being exposed to a trauma narrative can be re-traumatizing for someone and actually be damaging and harmful to them. Um, I know of other programs, and specifically three programs that are somewhat similar. Um, they have a day where they literally, that's what they do, is everyone shares the worst things that have ever happened to them all day long. And so
Like
for me,
going to the VA and talking about the worst thing that ever happened to your life, just so you can get disability.
imagine doing that for 8 hours straight, though, because you share your story and everybody else around you shares their story, and they're talking about the worst things that they've been through. You
Sounds
know,
depressing.
it's well, yeah, and I mean, I've been there myself. I've observed this. I've experienced that, and it is re-traumatizing. It's not so for me, I'm not too keen on recommending some of these programs for that particular reason alone. But also, I talk about in my book. I don't name the organization involved, but one of the points I make in my book is that understanding the archetypal context that your people are in is really important. So, our the Revenant Journey program is following what I call the archetype of the warrior's return. That the task of the person is to relate to aspects of the self that are helping them to heal, right? Well, there's another organization out there that does similar stuff, but their message is essentially that the problem with warriors is that they have not been properly initiated into manhood, which I think is absolutely ridiculous.
Hmm.
And so a lot of the message is like very much like you need to be a man, take responsibility for what you're responsible for and things that you're not responsible for. And you basically need to learn how to be a man because that's what men do. That if you're not taking charge of your life and doing these things, then you're not a real man, and we're here to make you a real man. And that if you become a real man, then you won't have these problems anymore, which I think is just so toxic and damaging and unproductive and counterproductive. So, again, there's a reason I'm not, and I should say I've worked with other organizations, but not too keen on recommending them. So,
No, again, that's everything that I have for this episode. But before we sign off, do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
no, thanks, man. I just appreciate you having me back. And, as always, it's great to be part of a larger community of veterans that cares about this stuff and that are talking about it. And that if, I'd say I'm a very, you know, I'm not hard to reach. So if there's anybody out there that, feels like they could use some help or direction and all that, hit up Matt or hit up me. You can get in touch with me through my website. So if you go to odysseusandtheor.com, you can get in contact with me and, happy to help in any way that I can.
No, again, Adam, I really appreciate this. I really had a good time talking on this chapter in particular. It was, uh, I think it's cathartic in a sense, in many ways, because it really dives deep into understanding ego, understanding the shadow, and understanding like how to be as a person and recognizing the inner conflict.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you so much. I'm glad that you found it worthwhile.
no, absolutely. And to the listeners, I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions, please reach out. We'll be here to help. But have a good one.